very, very warm welcome to the next episode of our Leaders for Humanity series. And today, I'm, if I can say that, even more happy and proud to have a thought leader, a visionary, a dear friend from very far away, and a great scholar, Bill Torbert, here with us. Bill, thank you so much for joining, and a warm welcome.
Great. It sounds like a wonderful occasion. Look forward to seeing what happens.
Likewise. And of course, I also want to say welcome as always to my co-host, Antoinette from Zurich, and to all of you coming and joining and listening to us. And as always, those of you who have listened to us a few times will know, I will briefly just frame the session and create the container, touch upon what the purpose of our Good Organizations Inquiry project is all about. And then Antoinette will do a proper introduction of Bill, and then we will get onto the road of the dialogue for today, which is titled A Lifelong Quest to Transform Our World, the Powerful Art of Action Inquiry. So hopefully you're all already very excited about this. What is the Good Organizations project? So Antoinette and I started this as a project of inquiry into the role of organizations in an ever more complex and faster changing world. How can organizations become good actors at a societal level and help to make this world more sustainable and better? How can organizations become a container for the development of all of the employees, but also other communities that are involved in the organization? And finally, how can organizations be a breeding ground for the individuals to develop themselves and lead a good life as individual human beings? And in this inquiry, we are involving a set of free thinkers who very often have very insightful and contrarian viewpoints to some of the dominating dialogues today. The research community, because those of you who know Antoinette know that we are very keen on kind of evidence-based and then some measures to prove some of the theories that we're discussing. And finally, what we have termed indeed leaders for humanity, like Bill, special people who are able to bridge both academia and practice, who have lived some of the concepts that they're talking about. And our hope is that we will be able to create a narrative that we can propose to some leaders of businesses or politicians who actually can take this forward and make it real. So that's the project scope. It's going to take a while, I guess, until we will see the results of this, but I'm very, very happy that you're with us, and together we can bring this to life. And with that, I would suggest, Bill, presenting you as a management professor is certainly not enough. So to Antoinette to give us a proper introduction. Antoinette, over to you.
Yeah, I just want to say I'm really, really humbled and grateful that you find the time to talk to us. And I really have to say that also after having read Numbskull the whole night, I'm even more humbled. So William Torbert, I'd start very formally with your academic career, because that's already something which is kind of to be admired from my side. You did your PhD at Yale University. Then you marched straight ahead to Southern Methodist University. You then became associate professor at Harvard University. And finally, you were full professor, and sometimes I think also dean for quite a long time at the Carroll School of Management, Boston College. But at the same time, and Otti said it already, you are always bridging to practice. You're also co-founder and now director emeritus at Global Leadership Associates, and you're director at Amara Collaboration. That's a newer venture you have started. So really, really great just to read only through the bullet points. But if I now go back to the book, then I tell you what I found really amazing. I mean, you really walk the talk, I find so, because you have been participating in the civil rights movement. You very early experimented, I mean, I think that was with 22, you already started, with reinventing education structures, and I think they still need to be reinvented. You were a first-hour action researcher who then became the inventor and champion of the Collaborative Development Action Inquiry. We are going to deep dive there. And of course, I was then very intrigued when I later saw in Journal of Management Inquiry, when asked about the good life, you said, well, the good life is about asking good questions, which perfectly fits, of course, with what you're doing. So I believe this is probably the core, but of course it's bigger. You have vast reflected contributions which span from leadership to organizational development, to awareness, learning, trust, and ethics. And so we're really, really excited. And because I know introductions never are complete, I would like to give you now the possibility to say a little bit more. And the first thing I would like to ask you, beyond these headlines, how would you describe yourself with a few attributes?
Well, the first thing that I think is important about me from the earliest part of my life is that I grew up outside the United States. From 3 to 6, I was in Madrid, Spain, and learned Spanish and forgot English. And then we went to Vienna, Austria, where I learned German from my friends and was sent to the French Lycée just to make sure I had enough different languages. And then later, my family, who was in the Foreign Service, were assigned to Italy, and I spent 2 summers there, which Italian is so easy to learn. I managed to learn that over those periods. So I began with a lot of different languages, and it always struck me how each language made the same word mean something a little different, or even a lot of different, in funny ways most of the time, like the French poisson and the American poison, or things like that, little jokes of that sort that only somebody who knew both languages could know. So luckily, I didn't boast about these things too much at the time. So that was very important. The different languages meant people had different perspectives on the world already, even before we got to the question of developmental perspectives. I think the other thing, I was very incredibly fortunate to be able to start my work experiences over summers during school in really different places. I was an intern at the US Senate after my freshman year, and really got to know, not personally, but know all 100 senators. At the time, I couldn't understand why anybody wouldn't know all 100 senators. It's been ages since I could name all of them. Then a second summer, my father was in Somalia, and I worked on an oil exploration team there. So that was a really different experience. And in a funny way, the beginning of my leadership training, but we'll leave that as a mystery for the moment. And then I spent the following year, summer, interviewing blue-collar workers all over the United States. I'd explored Europe very well by the time I was 20, but I didn't know the United States very well outside of the East Coast. So we interviewed those blue-collar workers, which led to my first book, which maybe we'll talk about a little later. And as you've already mentioned, getting the absurd opportunity to start and lead Upward Bound just after graduating from college at 22, immediately created a tremendous organizational challenge, which led me eventually to invent the theory of organizational transformation. So we'll come back to that. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Bill. And I think what this already shows, and again, an invitation for our friends and listeners to have a look at Numbskull. As you suggested, your final book, we will see about that. But I think the usage of your own experience and your own life as an inquiry, I think, comes through already in what you say now. The reflective capacity to look at our action in action, and you called it once, I think, meditation in action is something that we will explore. And maybe before we start, I want to just again show one slide, so to position and locate the audience and ourselves. So here we go. As always, we will try to explore the next hour, hour and a half, as long as there is energy and Bill is willing to entertain the answers and the questions. Three things. The first is, what is good and what is the good society? The second aspect is, what are good organizations? How are they being created and designed, and how are they lived? And finally, what is the good life at individual levels? What are good leaders, and how can we develop good leaders? In regards to Bill's work, which is very focused on leadership, as you've already heard, we will invert the order today. We will start with what is good and then go to the leadership aspects, and finally to the organizations. But I want to actually, because as Antoinette already said, you have looked at, as you have looked not only at practice, you've also looked at theory. I would actually like to start in a slightly different way today, which is to look really at what that theory is. So Antoinette, do you want to lead us with the first question to look a little bit at this CDAI?
Yeah, here, of course, I was intrigued as a researcher who is still doing only mixed methods research. I found it very, very interesting how you juxtapose that in science as a known paradigm. So maybe you can kind of first start to explain us how this is situated versus the other paradigms we have to make research and to have ontologies and epistemologies about the world.
Mm. Mm. Well, there's two major aspects of my theory. The first is an ontological element that I'll speak about, and the second is an epistemological element that I'll speak about. The epistemology is about different developmental action logics that we can go through, and if we do successfully, we will be in better touch with what I call the four territories of experience ontologically. And so I'll start with the ontology, since that is what the developmental process is moving towards. And you know, it's very interesting. For the last 500 years, we've had a sort of conversation between two ontological positions. One is realism, which is that it's the empirical world that is reality and the only reality. And we will eventually reduce consciousness to functions of the brain. The other is the exact opposite monism, which is idealism, which holds that consciousness is the primary reality, and that only through consciousness do we get to know something about the outside world, which is always being influenced by the way in which we are conscious. So what occurred to me, what I began to feel as I became an adult, was that neither of these is adequate, and nor just the two of them together. So then there are dualisms. In some case, the notion that that empiricism and phenomenology, to use different words, are both true, and we just don't know what the relationship between them is. And that part certainly describes our current state. But my argument is that the ontology that helps us is a fourfold ontology. Not only is the outside world true in some way which we don't fully understand, and not only is thought a separate, a distinct reality, but there are two other realities that are just as important, which Western society has essentially neglected up until, and thought that it had risen beyond, perhaps. One of them is our embodied experience. In other words, your behavior to me is in the outside world, but my behavior to me is something I'm experiencing from the inside, or perhaps blocking. Perhaps I don't hear myself the way I shout at other people, or I'm not aware that my hands are waving around because I'm so connected with the mental message I'm trying to send you. But in order to create a just world, we need to align a conscious purpose with thoughtful strategy, with a recognized embodied experience. As a leader, we need to know how we're acting in the moment to see what and then what are the external results? What are the empirical results in the outside world? We want to align those four things, but we can't until we develop awareness of these other two parts of reality that most people haven't paid attention to until very recently. Now we have a great deal on Merleau-Ponty and phenomenology and embodied practice, and people are suddenly concerned with practice. Well, that's the embodied part. And if you pay no attention to it in your science and your practice, you're not going to embody very effectively. So how do we come to the possibility of being aware of those and their interaction with one another? And I say, well, it's through a developmental process, which a number of people in the last 50 years have tried to explore. Erik Erikson is perhaps the best known original person, and also Piaget. Piaget didn't do lifetime development. He did childhood development primarily, but he was one of the originals. And Larry Kohlberg at Harvard and Jane Loevinger at Washington University were talking about development, but mainly talking about the early action logic, what I call action logics, the early stages of development. I became interested in the later stages of development because I was entering a spiritual work and trying to cultivate my own post-cognitive awareness in everyday life so that I could be aware of what I was actually doing and correct it in the midst of action if necessary. And so I focused probably more than most people on the later stages, but as you all know, we name these stages just to give the listeners a first sense of them. The opportunist stage as a young child, the diplomat stage in early teenage years, the expert stage in later college years or the early 20s. And then as one becomes a team leader in organizations, one may move to achiever, wishing to get things produced well and get the team to cooperate. But all of those action logics are conventional action logics. What we do is defined largely by already existing convention. And there's very little about later action logics where we begin to create our own norms if the norms that were running the group are destructive or not successful. And so then we have these four other action logics: redefining, transforming, alchemical, ironic. And very few people actually score on our empirical tests as moving beyond achiever. In the last 20 years, more people have scored at redefining because we have more cultural interplay. People realize they can't succeed with just their own assumptions that they grew up with. They have to reach out and recognize that there are fundamentally other perspectives and that we can redefine our world, so that there are more people at redefining, but it's still unusual to find people at transforming, alchemical, and ironic. So let me stop there. You can prod me to say something more, but
I think that's great framing, Bill. I want to point out and tease out, maybe to Antoinette's earlier question, a few aspects of this which I think might be overlooked. So I think firstly, what you describe is the creation of knowledge in action, and I think this is an aspect that has traditionally not been the focus of inquiry. And you write in your books there has been a turn from a pragmatic epistemology towards language and linguistic, but the turn into action And I think you quote Polanyi by saying knowledge is always for in action and for action. What is the quote? I got it somewhere. Gained through action and for action, which I think is really important in that. And what you're describing is a normative paradigm to actually look at the creation of knowledge and insight through action. Is that fair?
Yes, exactly. And so the aim of science becomes different from our current science. We are not merely seeking eternally true theories or generally true theories, descriptive theories of the world. We are actors in the world. And what we want are theories, first of all, that include our own action on the world. We want ways of doing experiments that take the experimenter into account rather than pretending to divide the experimenter from the experiment, something that has been shown again and again not to work, in fact. And the ultimate aim is timely action, is not valid generalization. That's a step on the way. I'm interested in theory. I'm interested in how empirically valid developmental theory is. But an even more important consideration is whether it helps me and other people and organizations to choose actions that are timely. Now, this is a huge mystery. I mean, who can even say that the action was timely, and timely for whom and for how long and in what historical perspective? And yes, it's an extremely difficult question to answer, and probably none of us answers it perfectly in an ongoing way. But even asking the question and attempting to answer it is a completely different move.
And I think, Bill, what I really appreciate, and again, I just want to make sure that our listeners come with us on this journey. There's almost a, because let's maybe frame also what single, double, and triple loop learning are in this context. And maybe if you want to go to Chris Argyris in regards to the espoused theory versus theory in use, because I think all of these concepts are somehow at home in your action inquiry, right? But at the heart of it, I think, is the ability to be on the balcony with myself in the action. But actually, it's almost be on the balcony to see myself on the balcony, because I'm inquiring in the process of transformation in the presence. So I'm almost 2 levels removed from the action, but as you just said, with the full acknowledgement that the only thing that matters is becoming better in being able to create timely action in the moment. And I find that is fascinating and certainly very far away. I'm looking at Antoinette from some of the scientific inquiry that we still today have in our universities.
Well, you know, my first chance to recognize how out of sync I was and how much feedback I needed was actually with Chris Argyris, who was my primary intellectual guide at the end of undergraduate and then during the graduate years at Yale. And I'd already met him and was interested about him. And I wanted him to come join a group of us who were seniors at Yale who met every week. And I thought he would help us to learn more about interpersonal relations and how to create trust and collaboration. And so I told all the people who were considering joining this group the spring before that I was really excited about this Argyris guy and how he could help us. And in fact, I was only going to join the society if everybody agreed that this would be a good thing to do. And I was very pleased. Everybody agreed. And then when he came in the fall for a dinner in order to really explore whether people wanted him and whether he would join us in the winter, suddenly the atmosphere was frozen and anxiety filled, and I couldn't understand it because everybody had agreed to this thing. But of course, as you've already guessed, I had really forced people to agree. And so in an effort to create a collaborative event, I had ruined it by already being unilateral and not realizing to what degree I was more of an advocate than an inquirer. And it literally led me for several months to shut up and listen to other people and ask them questions about themselves, and realize that I had way, way overemphasized advocacy over inquiry in everyday real settings. Yes, that was a double loop feedback to me, because it contested my assumptions about what power is, and my lack of clarity about what constitutes forms of unilateral power, coercion, charm, smart arguments. Those are all forms of unilateral power, different forms, but none of them is collaborative power, creating a shared vision. I hadn't succeeded in creating a shared vision with my classmates. And I wasn't successful at testing at the transforming level whether my thought was consistent with my action, and so forth. So in the ontological terms, getting back to this types of feedback, single loop feedback is feedback between the external world and my embodied action. So I tried to hammer the nail, I missed it, I bent the nail, I've got to try again. This time I land in front of the nail. The third time I actually hit the nail on the head. That's single loop feedback from the outside world, the empirical result of my action, to trying it a different way. Double loop feedback is feedback that goes all the way to the strategy, the intellectual strategy you are actually using, to your action logic, not your espoused logic, but your logic in use. And that's why we talk about action logics. They're not just logics, they're the logics that actually drive my action, and I'm not quite aware of it most of the time. So double loop feedback asks you to transform your structure and strategy in some way. And triple loop feedback goes all the way up to this post-cognitive consciousness, to your purpose, and it rings a bell and says, you're not being true to your purpose. You need to fundamentally ask yourself, what are you really committed to? That's a first. Those are very difficult concepts, and one can spend a long time trying to get clear about them, especially triple loop learning.
But I think we will go exactly there in the next section, because I think what is also striking me, and maybe that is not quite right, but there's a difference between a normative theory about the development of learning and thinking vis-a-vis a normative axiological theory or a morality that I can attain to in that triple loop learning to say this is right or wrong. But that is something that we will briefly query you about in the next section to see what is the difference there. But I want one, if I may, on the theoretical side, one thing that I found, again, very intriguing, I want to throw in, and that is time. Bill, because I think with Amara in a recent seminar, you talked about 3 or 4 dimensions of time. You've written an article about 6 dimensions of time. And I think there's almost something, Marie von Ebner-Eschenbach, a German poet, once wrote that the power over the moment is the power of life. And when you spoke about the different dimensions of time, I could almost sense it coming to life, that you're stepping into time with a different sentiment of having more dimensions to play with. And if you become aware of that, it allows you maybe to take this step out of the moment into these different inquiry logics that you described. But can you just go a little bit into what is time for you today?
Well, the 6 dimensions were 3 dimensions of space and 3 dimensions of time, just to clarify that. And the first dimension of time is the one we all share, which is the notion of a kind of continuity from the past to the future. So we're moving along this thing, all of us, whether we pay attention to it or not at a particular moment. But then so that could be called the horizontal dimension. Then the vertical dimension of time is this awareness in the moment. So now I'm not just looking at things in terms of how they happen, how I think about how they happen over time. I'm actually fundamentally more present in the moment. I'm aware of myself being here and having choices right now. And, it's possible to cultivate that sense in meditation, sitting on a cushion, but it's very difficult to sustain it even there. Within moments of reaching a deep calm, I'm thinking about a girl I was attracted to yesterday, or I'm thinking about my writing, what I want to do next. So we're constantly losing our footing in this capacity for being present in the present. But it's only through that capacity that I become aware of all these four territories at once. And it's only through the capacity to be present that I can intervene to change what we're doing right now. So that's the second dimension of time, I claim. And then I say the third dimension of time is, obviously, when you analogize it to space, is the volume of time. The x-axis, the y-axis, the z-axis. What does that mean, the volume of time? It means that I actually experience possibilities, also the other volume of possibilities. So instead of just thinking about what to do for the next meeting, I reach a state where there's actually different possibilities are passing in front of my mental gaze, and I'm not attaching to any one of them. I'm just letting them go through, and eventually one sort of has life in it. One wants to be realized in fact, and then if I start planning an event from that kind of seed of living possibility, my relationship to the event works much, much better from the beginning to the end than if I start by trying to make a list of the things that should be done at the event and create an agenda all from the mental level. So I don't know if that's enough, but that's
very, very nice. And what it brought up in me was Ben Zander with his wife, I think Susie, has written a wonderful book about the art of possibilities. And it's a little bit this notion that with every next word we say, every next action we take, we become agents of potentiality. And I think you're bringing that out very, very nicely. So we've grounded the session in a little bit, and we will make some of the materials available for everybody because there are some new concepts with the notion of CDAI and especially action inquiry. But I think we've already heard a little bit about the ability in the moment to take right decisions. And of course, we are after good organizations. So this notion of what is right, what is wrong is close to our heart. So I will
be a good idea to also kind of quickly summarize what we heard, because it was such a rich section before we go to the next section.
I was thinking about it, Antoinette, and I said I'd rather kind of put it on the website for people to look at because I could get it wrong in the heat of the action. But if you want to try, please feel free.
Well, I just want to kind of, because we were discussing that.
Go on, try, have a go. Bill I'm sure correct.
I want to bridge it to current science. And I really heard a lot of things where you really contribute and where I believe people should really have a look at your books and your articles. And the first thing is really, we are in what you have already said, in a replication crisis. So we can't, as you say, ever measure something without being involved. So this is something which is struggling, economics, psychology, etc. We also are kind of complaining about the theory-practice gap. So all the evidence-based people saying, oh, practice is not using our nice evidence. And we try to mend that with something I find very sympathetic, that's engaged scholarship. But what I hear now, even if I do engaged scholarship, even if I do something like I'm doing with Otti, so we are formulating the problems in the practice, we're trying to work with practitioners, we bring in theory. I still do not contribute timely action. So I like that a lot. And that's really something to consider for all the researchers out there. If you care about this practice and theory gap, then have a look at what we were just discussing. That's what I just wanted to summarize.
Very nice. And Bill, I want to, let's go to good, but I want to throw one more thing in that I'm just reading in my notes, because there's, we will come to communities of inquiry and the necessity of, I think Aristotle suggested, the growth with and within community. We will come to that a little bit later. But in this growth in the meditation and action, so to speak, you're talking about the playful reciprocal initiatives between you and the system. So is there something about play and experimentation that is a precondition to that learning?
I think so, absolutely. I mean, play is one of the loveliest words in the language, in my view, and is the process by which we can transform. You have to try new things without certainty that it's going to work or not. So play is the process by which people develop, I would say. This is one of the reasons why I've always regarded leisure as more important than work, even though work is obviously necessary. But leisure, not meant as hanging out and getting drunk in front of the TV, but leisure meant as free action, as play, as playing a game together. I would hold, in the last decade, a number of alchemists' work parties, 3-day-long events in which all the members, who would be 12 or 14 or 16, would each run part of the 3 days. There was no one running the whole thing. We were running it together, a community of inquiry, and we were playing together. And what were your boundaries? What are my boundaries? How do we want to redefine the boundaries? Were all constant questions. So that's what I retired to after I left work.
You've made good on some of your writings in being, for the most part, puppies, where I think Antoinette, Bill is claiming that in academia there is no theory actually underpinning leisure. And I think it's very interesting to see some of the writings from, I think, the first book that you had, Bill, if I'm not mistaken. And I think in Numbskull, you're suggesting that you had a choice between becoming a Sufi jester and a Harvard professor, which I think I'm glad you've landed somewhere in the middle, I guess. But Antoinette, do you want to take us to the next section?
Yeah, it's just, of course, now you just gave me something I have to respond to. I wouldn't kind of completely agree with you. Bill was certainly one of the first who looked at that topic. But I mean, of course, we have intrinsic motivation, which is all about play. And there is a huge theory growing in importance. And I like also Jane Dutton's work. And I think you have published with Jane Dutton as well. So she is looking big way at playfulness and how that contributes to being able to do collaborative work in teams. So I guess you probably have cross-fertilized there, just to kind of take that up. But before we do only shop talk here, I think I should slowly move to the next section, which is really about the good society. And I think you called the good society the sustainable society, if I read that correctly in various of your works, and brought up such words like integrity, mutuality, social justice, greater harmony with the natural environment. So these were the attributes I found when you were thinking about the sustainable society. Can you characterize these aims a little bit for us so that we understand better what good for you means?
Well, people will find in Appendix A of Numbskull a discussion of many different theories, but one of them is Rawls' theory of justice, which I was enormously impressed by because he was able to develop a theory that relied not relied on at least two definitions of justice. One being the utilitarian definition of what are the best outcomes for the most people, and the other being a principled approach to justice, which was creating a system of liberty for everybody. But as what he didn't talk about was the role of action in creating justice. He was talking mainly in principled terms, but he did have a fascinating discussion of how families had to act in order to bring children up in such a way that they would contribute to a just society. And what it required of parents, he said, was that they ought to help the child move through the morality of authority, which is the parent's guidance, through the morality of association, which is working things out with friends, to the highest one he called the morality of principle. So you do things because they are in principle right, not just because your friends agree or your parents say so. But the parents, to begin to cultivate their children, needed to be able to enact principled rules that they could then explain to their children as the children reached an age for understanding those principles. And the parents had to congruently enact those principles, because otherwise the children would view the parents as hypocrites. Well, that is, of course, an unbelievably demanding thing for parents to supposedly need to do in order to create a just society. And obviously, the vast majority of us don't succeed much of the time. But again, you see that there, as I say, Rawls was able to describe how a just society could remain just once it was created, but he was unable to describe how to create that just society in the first place. And obviously, one starts from a position of relative injustice. And as we have been seeing in the United States for the last 5 years, there's incredible inability to apply principles to oneself and to bring up children in an inquiring manner, if I may say.
But I think, Bill, if I can interject with one thought, I think when Amartya Sen is criticizing Rawls' theory, I think he's also suggesting this veil of ignorance, which really goes back, and you quote Rousseau a lot, to the notion of a contractual kind of agreement between liberal actors in society, is flawed to a degree, because that just is theoretical and practically doesn't exist, which I think is very similar to your notion that actually all of the actors in society have their own kind of idiosyncratic way of seeing the world. And I think we spoke to Stefano Zamagni last week about his notion of a civil society. And I think he would probably go even further. And I think he is using Ken Arrow's theorem of impossibility to suggest if we go with some of the logic that Rawls suggests, we could actually never find that society that you described with Rousseau's word of the general will vis-a-vis the will of all. So the general will, people will just never agree on something that is good for all. So in theory, that looks good, but in practice, it doesn't work. And final thing, we are talking to Paul Adler very soon. And Paul would probably suggest, and this is, I think, where Antoinette is coming from, without an ethos of interdependence, of participation and mutuality, the society can never become good. And I just wondered, that sounds very close to some of the remarks you're making.
Well, right. I mean, we need to find small communities that are a little ahead of the rest of society to help us learn how to act in a more principled way, how to act in a more utilitarian way, how to act in a more virtuous way, and how to do so at particular moments. And, you know, I had this, I guess people nowadays would call it traumatic experience. I never thought of myself as having gone through such trauma, but when I directed the Yale Upward Bound program, in the very first week of the first summer, we were actually trying to create a constitution for the program with the students out at a camp. And it seemed impossible at certain moments. And at one moment, there was actually a fight that broke out between the students and the staff members. Actually, it turns out when it was looked at closely, it was the staff members who started it, although they hadn't even quite realized that. They thought it was the students' fault, as usual. They were blaming the other. But we were able, in the course of 2 or 3 hours, to resolve that fight in a way where the antagonists shook hands with one another. And we went on to really a very good summer together. But the second year, which occurred after Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy had been assassinated, and when the Black Power movement had suddenly risen up in the country, and our program was 2/3 Black, and I was still director the second summer, but I became named White Devil by at least some of the Black staff and students. And we had another crisis at the end of the first week, the second summer, and that time, neither I nor anyone else was able to have such a quick and satisfactory resolution to the fight. And that, you know, left an enormous impression on me in terms of how difficult this kind of thing is, even when you have a lot of well-meaning people involved, and even how important. There was one particular staff member who was especially poisoned, and I use the word advisedly. And if we'd actually considered not including him on the staff. He had been there the first summer and had been very constructive. But in the Black Power process of the intervening winter, he had turned extremely radical. And in fact, it turns out he got murdered in a gunfight 2 years later in Chicago. And I was in favor of not including him the second summer, but I allowed myself to be convinced by other people that we ought to include him. If we had not included him, I think it would have made an enormous difference in that second summer. So it's becoming aware of, oh my gosh, I gave way to being collaborative and compromising at just the moment I should have been more unilateral. And then on the other hand, in some cases, I was more unilateral when I should have been more collaborative. So learning that is such a painful process.
And I think, Antoinette, back to you, I think it points to phronesis again in our conversations. But what do you think?
Well, that's right.
That's sorry, we have been discussing about how Aristotle's suggestion of phronesis in the moment, and sometimes that might imply to be more directive, sometimes it might imply to be more systemic, so to speak, might indeed what we need to learn. But Antoinette, I know you want to go into the parents' example a little bit.
Well, I can do it also with the example I was just given, because I hear a lot of being able to trust, living vulnerability as well. And now Bill gave us another thing we can maybe discuss later, because we are also discussing whether sometimes you also need to be stricter with boundaries and not to include everybody, which I also find an important aspect. But let us first go, because you were saying it's about the action, and you were bringing these nice parents example, and I'd just like to probe a little bit deeper, because I believe that the concept of vulnerability you bring up, which is such a difficult concept for most, might also help us a little bit to understand. So I have two ways to look at vulnerability, and you have to tell me which one is the right from your perspective. So there was one philosopher, Antoinette, who said vulnerability is rooted in our human condition to be interdependent with others. And what's interesting about that, in the end, it means that we have the mandate, the ethical mandate for genuine care. And that would, for also, in my opinion, be something which really would be something in the parents' example and action-oriented. And then, of course, we have Hannah Arendt, and I think you even met her. You were so lucky. Yeah. And she says vulnerability is linked to the unpredictability of the human existence. And from there, she develops, that's why we have the ethical mandate to show integrity. So can you work with these concepts? Is that related to the action you were talking about?
Let's see, I'm trying to find a handle on this doorway that you've erected in front of me. Let's see, I mean, I don't disagree with any of those things that have been said. I think the vulnerability has to be partly a humility about how much one doesn't know in any situation. So, no matter how much one has studied history or a particular organization or the person one is facing directly, one certainly doesn't know everything about them. And one doesn't know everything about all of the different environmental factors that may be affecting the present moment. And so to acknowledge that lack of knowledge and that lack of control is critical, first of all, for gaining interdependence. In other words, I can't solve this by myself. I genuinely need your help. And the acknowledgement by one person of vulnerability encourages other people to acknowledge their vulnerability, which of course then, as you point out, creates greater interdependence. So for the moment, I just got a little handle on that. I don't know if...
But I think it resonates with, in one of your papers, the definition of the good life, where I think you suggest it's good money, it's a good work, good friends, and good questions. And then you, in the last paragraph, suggest that good questions come first, as Antoinette already said at the beginning. And I think, so the humbleness of the inquiry but I believe good friends are second in your paradigm. So being upheld in that community. And I loved it. We were on a session with Otto Sharma recently where he was talking about his social presencing theater, but also his company and how he founded it 20 years ago. And some of the founding members were on that session. And they suggested that Otto had been held up by those 5, 6, 7 founders to grow together with them through the years. And I thought that was a very beautiful thing to happen. So if you can not be alone, I guess, with that humbleness and grow together. But I want to go to the notion of good again in regards to corporate social responsibility. And looking also at the success of corporate transformation. You said we were in the age of dependence, and then after kind of 500 AD, we started to liberate ourselves. 1500 AD, we started to liberate ourselves with the evolution of neoliberal capitalism and so on. And now we're in the third age, I think you call it. Similar, you said you're in the third age, the world is in the third age. And my question is, whatever our definition of good, is it getting better? Is it getting worse? And what can we do?
Mm-hmm. Well, you see, I mean, the world is exhibiting day by day right now how difficult it is for people to move towards interdependence and for countries to move towards interdependence, as I call it, dependence, independence, interindependence. Each later move contains the earlier move, even linguistically there in those three.
So Bill, just to clarify, I think you're saying people become independent in regards to self-actualization, and then they step voluntarily into interdependence. Is that behind your notion? Which Antoinette relates immediately to Alan Fiske's notion of horizontal individual. So I think that is exactly the hybrid that we are looking at. So just to clarify, thanks, Bill.
Yes. Yeah. And the phrase interdependence to me is really useful, because interdependence can be mutual codependence. Two people can be codependent on one another, or it can be two independent people who mutually contract. But interdependence is a covenant between people or groups. But we see, I mean, the difficulty of America working with allies, and America's incredible hubris in repeatedly thinking that it is exceptional, that we're an exceptional nation. Maybe you don't hear this very much in Europe, but people in America are constantly talking about, that, and, for some people, it means we don't need to obey the standards of anybody else. If we want to enter a country in order to pacify somebody we don't think is right, like, Hussein in Iraq, we should do it because we're the only ones who understand what independence is about and what a just society is about. Now, as Biden tries to step back from that kind of orientation, you hear people on the right saying he's giving up, he's weak, and he's gradually trying to rebuild the alliances with Europe, but not fast enough for some of the Europeans. We got out of Afghanistan too quickly without enough consultation with the Europeans. It's very difficult to move towards this interdependence. We've had the United Nations for 70 years, but it has no power. Basically, we're unwilling to give power to agencies of interdependence yet. And some people, and because then some people, want to retreat to codependence with their own identity group. And so you see parties splitting in all the countries as people return to smaller units with which they hope they can successfully be codependent. But that's not going to solve the problems either, because there's going to be more antagonism between those groups. So we are at the beginning of this age, which might take 500 years, just the way the age of moving from dependence to independence took about 500 years. We're just at the bare beginnings of this new age, and there is breakdown of the previous age. It's no longer adequate, but it's much more difficult to build the new age. It'll be slow in coming.
But I think also, as Antoinette alluded to, I think there's something about caring, and I would suggest even about loving, where if that is not there as a precondition that allows us to overcome ourselves, so to speak, in the service of something greater, it's probably not going to happen. And the question is, what is that logic that could make us go there? It was interesting to talk to Stefano Zamagni, who's coming from a Christian social thinking perspective. And of course, some of that is in a religious context is being sorted. And I recall, I think we discussed yesterday that Schumacher once famously suggested that our experiment, Antoinette, what was it exactly? So the society's experiment to live without God has failed.
Yeah.
So do we need faith, Bill? Do we need religion to help us to step out of ourselves?
And just to drill that a little bit down, because you ask a lot from people, and you have also realized that not a lot of people are willing to go on that journey. So do we need something at the end of the journey, a spiritual path, phase? What do you think?
Well, I experienced a born-again Christian moment in my life, and for most of my life, considered the notion that love was the most fundamental quality of the universe, that was very important. I have to say, I've come to a different place right now. We'll see where it goes. And one way of characterizing the space I've come to is to say that I regard myself as an active agnostic. And that even, with regard to the question of is there some form of life after death, rather than having a faith that there is one, I feel that it's more important to be in a questioning state as I approach death. I mean, that the way to be active in regard to death is to be wondering what comes next, not to pretend I know. To you, that's a little unfair, but to talk about faith as to pretend to know, that's not good. But so to me, that seems more consistent with the idea of inquiry as the fundamental good. And, as Socrates said, we fear death. We don't know what happens next. Everybody does it. But it doesn't mean that we can know what comes after it. There are so many different kinds of love. That doesn't mean that I don't think love is important, and more importantly, feel that love is important. And I felt a lot of loneliness in this COVID time because so many of my friends are spread around the world and not here in Boston. And so friendship, loving friendship, non-possessive loving friendship is a key element of my life. And again, it seems to be very difficult for people to transform what they mean by love from being a falling in love type of love to an acting in love kind of love. So I'm definitely still in the search for true love.
Which I think resonates, Antoinette, with what we heard from both Stefano and Luigino Bruno, because when they speak about love, it's agape. It's the gratuitousness, they call it. So I'm giving without an expectation to have something in return, with the hope that maybe my gift might be exchanged forward. And therefore it creates, I think, that community that you described at the third level, a community of communities where the reciprocity and mutuality becomes a guiding principle. And Antoinette, I think yesterday we heard from Simon Weston about Quakers. And I was inspired that the Quaker philosophy seemed to actually embrace some of this, also with the spiritual decision-making. But Antoinette, final word to you maybe, and then we move to the leadership section.
And possibly with the action inquiry as well, but maybe we talk about that later. I just want to, because you brought up death, and you really very touchingly reflect on this in your newest book. And you said something like, death is needed for humanity. Have you already explained that to us? Is that what you meant by death is needed for humanity? That I kind of see that it's there and start questioning and have an active stance? Or is there more to it?
Well, right. I mean, it is a key of our human condition that we live a finite lifetime, and that affects every possible decision we could make, although often unconsciously rather than consciously. People, to me, these billionaires who are trying to figure out how they can be uploaded into a computer and live for eternity are incredibly stupid. I mean, it's so fundamental that to be meaningful to us, life has to have finitude. And you mentioned earlier, Antoinette, boundaries, and that boundaries are a key to making life meaningful. And so rather than trying to be a little child and live in eternally, it's important to accept that limit and the fact that it is unknown when it will come. Any of us might die at any time, and so we'd better be doing what we mean to be doing, because we may not be here to do it soon enough. So anyway, I don't know.
Very interesting, and I think Freud would probably also suggest that this notion of spirituality is very connected.
Oh no, we all froze suddenly.
Oh, we are back. I was saying, it brought up Freud and this notion of spirituality being very connected to the fear of death. So this desire, I think, to also transcend is probably linked to the ultimate, like you say, the finiteness of us being on this earth. I wanted to move a little bit to leadership, because you already explained the action logics. And so we went through the 4 stages of opportunist, diplomat, technician, achiever. And I need to make sure I got your latest taxonomy, because
expert. We now use expert
not
instead of
technician. I knew there was something wrong. And then the 4 later stages. So we will have, of course, all the materials on the website. I wanted to ask a few maybe simpler questions briefly, because you mentioned Piaget, you mentioned Kohlberg, Alexander, Keegan. So maybe just a quick one. And I'm interested in Gurdjieff as well with the work. So how does your work build, but might differ from some of the other frameworks that people might be familiar with? And is it in the notion of power?
Well, I think because I've been concerned with leadership, I've definitely put a lot more attention on the question of power than any other developmentalist that I'm familiar with. And this idea that, like any important word, power, time, love, each word has an interpretation that relates to each of the action logics. Or to put it differently, each action logic has its kind of implicit definition of these important words. So, but in my case, yes, power and inquiry, I mean, action is a form of power. So, so action inquiry could be written power inquiry, except it would make no sense. So yes, I mean, realizing when to use what kind of power is a central element of action inquiry. Now, sorry, I think I'm losing the rest of it. Prompt me.
No, I think that, the definition of stages. I think if we look at Keegan or Piaget, as you said, was of course more focused on the child development side. But I think, to a degree, is it important? Let me maybe ask a facetious question to a degree. Is it important what set of frameworks people hold in their mind to become better in learning, if we put it that way? Is there a critical difference if I go with Keegan or with Barrett vis-a-vis the Bill Torbert framework?
Well, my framework, even in the words of opportunist, diplomat, expert, describes types of action rather than states of mind. So, as in Keegan's case, I think that it's or say in Michael Common's case with his very abstract hierarchy of complexity, which is untethered to emotional or behavioral reality, in my view, and therefore becomes dangerous because hyper-intellectualism is one of the qualities of modern science. And so we need to be careful if we're looking forward to a different future, not to overemphasize the vertical in an intellectual sense of going higher and becoming more abstract. And in terms of leadership, it's quite possible for a person to be very aware of the notion of subject turning into object in Keegan's version, which is a wonderfully brilliant intellectual description, but to be able to be aware of the inner moves without having in any way mastered the outer moves. So then we just have another sort of intellectual community rather than a really living community.
Brilliant. But I think that's, Bill, that is great, because I hadn't appreciated that, I think, consciously. And that makes a lot of sense. I think one other aspect that, Antoinette, I think you wanted to go into is a little bit the measures and the evidence. Is that something you want to touch on?
Well, maybe more briefly than in a very long fashion, because you put up on your website lots of papers where you kind of validate the GLP. But I still find it interesting. It's measuring implicit beliefs, action, logic. So it's interesting that you then, of course, have the sentence completion variant in there. But I would also wonder, first of all, maybe you can explain that to us a little bit more. And second of all, while I was reading through your work, and I haven't had, I didn't have the time to read all your books as Otti did, it still occurred to me that there might be some linkages to other implicit theories, such as, for instance, McClelland and his hope and fear and power motives. And I was just kind of curious whether you have ever seen how it's related and how it's different, because I'm sure it's also different, but that would be also something that future researchers could take up. So tell us a little bit more about the measurement instrument, if that's possible. And the second thing, have you ever tried to validate it with some concepts which are a little bit further away, which are not directly from the developmental theory, but very mainstream more?
Well, first of all, the measure, as you've said, is a sentence completion measure. So it's an open-ended measure. It's a measure in which you project your structure to finish the sentence. This is one of the reasons why I love this measure. It is not a prefabricated set of alternatives where you put 1 or 3 or 5 or 7 at two extremes, where the researcher has structured your answers for you and you're merely providing content. So that was the first reason why I liked this measure and wanted to adopt it. Of course, Lovinger had only created it for young girls, and therefore it had a bunch of sentence stems that weren't really relevant for adult leaders. If we were going to include men in it, we needed to change it somewhat. But in any event, that's the first thing. The measure itself seems to me to be analogically appropriate for trying to learn about somebody's action logic. You ask them to project it on it. We've done a lot of work on reliability, and we're very confident about the reliability, but because reliability is never more than, say, 95% at the highest, that means that 1 out of 20 of your clients or research subjects is getting the wrong answer to their action logic. And so we actually reliability test every single measure we receive. So we're doing tremendous effort at empirical validity. Secondly, we ask now we have a variety of ways of asking people who take the measure to make their own estimates. And there are different ways of doing that, but we want the person to make a commitment and to then be able to compare if there are differences between their estimate and the measure. We say, look, you know much more about yourself than we do. We know much more about the measure than you do. So the two forms, the subjective estimate and the objective estimate, need to be, can confront one another. And it may be that you're right in some larger sense, and it may be that the measure's right. And that has yielded, very interesting corrections in particular cases. And then we ask that we invite people, and in the case where we're working with organizations, they pay for having a coach debrief the GLP. So there you have the second person kind of knowledge coming in, where the coach can see in the debrief, oh, you're acting like an achiever right now, and you keep claiming that you're at redefining. So it's possible to use that data that arises in the instant in a kind of second person research. So the fact that the research process includes all three voices, to me, seems an important element. Now, what have we validated? That's reliability and so forth, but what have we validated the measure against? Hardly at all other measures, unlike most psychological research, which compares my measure to your measure. Well, the hell with that, I said. Why don't we get down to practice here? Let's find empirical measures of practice. And so we have used so many different empirical measures of practice. This is one of the things that makes me about it. So, we invite people to, in some studies, to ask for feedback. They're not guaranteed getting feedback on this measure. We say, come back in 2 weeks when we will have finished scoring this, and if you want to receive some feedback about what this is about, we'll give it to you. Well, it turns out that there's an absolute perfect correlation. The people at the lowest action logics, diplomat in this case, never asked for feedback. None of them asked for feedback. The experts, about 1/10 of them asked for feedback. The achievers, half of them asked for feedback. And virtually every single person beyond achiever asks for feedback and then wants more after the first hour. So that's just, then we've had people do an in-box test, in-basket test, where they receive 40 memos from subordinates when it turns out their predecessor was killed in an auto accident a few days before, and he's coming in on a Sunday, and he's going to read these 40 recommendations or reports on different things, and he's going to take action on them. And you find out that that the people at the conventional action logics go through the 40 pieces as fast as they can and make an action for each one of them. Whereas the people at the later action logics read them all through without taking any action. I mean, I'm exaggerating the extreme here. It wasn't always precisely that way. And then they divide it into 4 piles of related issues. And then they suggest what the person ought to do. But very frequently, they also say, and if you have a problem with this, or you don't think this is the right solution, let me know. So they make an inquiry seeking feedback. So it's that kind of, that's what we have validated the measure on. And that's what makes me so confident that it does actually measure an action logic, is how people take action.
And I think it's, fascinating. This is 2 researchers getting very excited about the evidence for the research that they have. But
that's the best questions, Antoinette.
I have to say, I'm almost resting my case here, but I want to move us into the vertical leadership development, into the organizational development. But I have to ask, if I'm allowed in this duet of researchers, one very facetious question, Bill, which is, we spoke to Simon Weston yesterday, and Simon was saying leadership is always autobiographic. So beyond the measures, I have to ask you the question, in the Ionist, how much Bill is in the Ionist?
Well, you will notice if you read very much of my writing that there's almost nothing about the ironist in my writing, and we never measure anybody at my ironist. And who's in the ironist category is Gurdjieff. That's what the action logic is modeled after. Or who the action logic is modeled after. Not only Gurdjieff, if you read the end of Managing the Corporate Dream, you see that I have other examples. Charles de Gaulle is an example for me of an ironist leader. He recognized that he was putting on a mask when he operated in public. And although he was quite apparently authoritarian in many of his ways, he was also a complete democrat in the sense that as soon as he was elected out of office, he yielded it and sort of disappeared to his country estate. So he was able to wear a mask in public, take it off when he was not in public. But so there's the answer to your facetious question.
I think I will just go with that, because I think you talk about the archetype of the anthropological jester, of the Jungian trickster. And I think you, in one of your writings, I think it's in my preferred book, which is, of course, The Power of Balance, you describe yourself as diabolical in one of the sentences somewhere. So I will just take your answer as a half non-answer with me into the next question. But Antoinette, I think...
It's an ironic answer.
Exactly. I think you hit it. And this reminds me of one of the things that I want to put into the closure section, but building good organizations. So we have a ontological view of a reality that is much more than just a positivist reality. We have a normative framework that allows us to ascertain how our thinking works and translate that into learning in action. And now I think we want to go a little bit into one. We already said this can only work in communities of inquiry, because I will never see myself sufficiently. The mutuality of co-elevation is needed. Secondly, there's something about translating this into an organizational context. And I think John Schoen was suggesting in his foreword that you are unashamedly normative in suggesting organizations should develop people. So I want to ask you a little bit, maybe again, to frame us. Two things. One, what is the role of communities of inquiry? And secondly, liberating structures, liberating processes, what are they in the context of an organization, be that courses that you describe or be that a normal public company?
You can tell that I'm beginning to tire, in the sense that I have trouble remembering the whole question.
I will break it down. So, communities of inquiry, let's start there. What is the role and relevance of a community of inquiry? Right. Sorry, I'm making my questions too complicated. I think that's more than you becoming tired.
Well, first of all, of course, the phrase community of inquiry comes from empirical science originally, comes from the Harvard philosopher Charles Peirce. And what he meant by a community of inquiry that was key to science was that you had colleagues with whom you tested your work and your conclusions and your hypotheses. So it was an intellectual community of inquiry. Even more specifically, it had to do with testing your statistical models and whether they were actually the right model to apply to a certain study. So it was a purely scientific, in the ivory tower sense of science, community. And so when I came along and said, look, I want to do research on myself, I want to do research with the upward bound staff on whether we're creating a good organization, and I want to create third person research. Do our students get better in some sense from having been with us? And in fact, after that first year, we cut out only 3 out of 60 of our students quit school, whereas all of them had been predicted to quit in their next year, and New Haven's dropout rate was cut in half. So that was a third-person measure of how we were doing as a community. But the ultimate community of inquiry is one in which the members can fully confront one another, potentially, also support one another, and also vulnerably self-disclose to one another, and confront one another about one's immediate state of awareness. I mean, am I getting carried away here, or am I still sober and present? So the attempt is to have a group. This worked out very well, say, when I went to SMU, and we had these courses with 400 students, and we had 5 faculty members and as many as 20 student consultants who would have taken the course and now work with the groups in the course. And we put tremendous energy into that community of 25 people. We had, a 2-hour session every week in which the consultants described difficulties they'd had with their groups, and we consulted to them about how they could be more effective, in which we read books and critiqued them about what it meant to try to develop students to be more independent, more entrepreneurial, and where we also had a session after each class, which were evening classes, and we went to the bar. Only a young professor could do this kind of thing and survive. But completely informal conversations, people playing ping pong and foosball in between, talking with one another, but really more able to get to the bottom of things in that informal environment. That was part of being a community of inquiry.
And I think, Antoinette, we spoke about Amy Edmondson's concept of psychological safety. I think, Bill, there's something that resonates in what you say, but I think you also said in one of your books, people had to be prepared to be each other's enemies, so to speak, and in brackets, and friends. So I think there's this notion of really caring enough about each other to really invest in each other's growth, which I think transcends the normal community notion to a wide degree. And again, to Antoinette's point, requires that vulnerability that we spoke about. I wanted to go briefly before asking, I'm sure Antoinette wants to go a little bit in the last 10 minutes into some discussion, liberating structures and processes to create such communities of inquiry as a matter of day-to-day work or day-to-day students' educational practice. What have you learned? How do these work?
The idea of what I first called liberating structure, but then renamed liberating discipline, because the idea is that it's not simply a structure which the organization places over people's work, but it is a relationship between the leadership and the followership in an organization, in which the followership has to make a commitment. So it's a discipline that people are taking on, both the leaders and the followers. And it's based on the notion that the leadership is at a later action logic collectively than the followership. And that the followership is not yet going to be motivated directly by the idea of personal growth, by the idea of having their paradigm confronted and being given the opportunity to grow to the next stage. But so you create structures that, in one sense, force the participants, as Rousseau talked about, forcing people to be free. These liberating disciplines push people. At first, it seems to them arbitrarily, and the great example I have from the SMU experience, there were many, but one is we asked students to write a learning paper every week, and it could be as short as a single page. We said they had to include 4 elements: a situation that they were in the previous week, in class or anywhere else in their life. And it would first describe how they acted in the situation. And then it would reflect, there would be a paragraph of, well, why did I do this? What was I thinking when I did it? And then there would be a prediction about how they could be more effective. And finally, they would describe an action they took subsequent to beginning the paper to act differently from the first time. Well, students at first didn't take these 4 things seriously. I mean, they just heard it as write something about your experience in class last week. And so they would write something, would be purely descriptive of other people, and they'd get a 0 on the paper, which was very unusual. Nobody gives zeros. And then they would try to figure out what you do. And people said, well, if you say I in the paper, the teachers seem to like it better. And so they would say I the next week in the paper. And then they might get a 25 or a 50, still failing, of course. And eventually, they would figure out what you had to do. And once they figured out what they had to do, the paper became useful to them. They wanted to do it. And so the idea is, forcing them through a process which then becomes familiar and recognized by themselves as liberating, as growth producing. So we could go to a lot of other examples of liberating disciplines, but maybe that's.
But I knew I was getting the liberating processes wrong. Now I know why you've called it disciplines. And I think, again, there is this notion of discipline in self-balancing that comes through in everything that you have described in your books. And I think that's, it almost goes into sacrificing, but I don't want to go there. I think, Antoinette, you probably want to ask something more about management.
We have that down the line, but I think we should go on maybe with one a little bit more practical question. I just want to say that we are going to be sure to put up the case study you've written about what you did at Southern Methodist University, because I think it really is a very brilliant read and people will understand even better after they heard what you were saying. I'm just coming from a very practical angle because I happen to be an HR professor more by coincidence. And HR practices, in my opinion, often do the opposite. So they prevent reflection, they prevent this type of discipline we were hearing, that prevent liberating. You don't have to pick HR, you can also pick organizational practices, but if you could do away with some of the instruments and practices organizations are using, which would be your top 3 or top 2 where you say they really have to go? They just kind of destroy everything.
That's a great question, which I haven't thought about before. Let's see how fast I can think. Well, the first thing that comes to mind to me is annual performance reviews. These are such artificial situations that are created. And on the one hand, there's so much pressure about them. And on the other hand, so little is learned from them typically. And also, bosses get to keep all of their feedback for a once-a-year dump on the subordinate, so they ought to forbid the annual performance evaluation, and they ought to require that each boss develop a feedback system with their subordinates that shows that the subordinates improve as a result of the feedback they get from the boss. In other words, the pressure ought to be on the boss to create a good system of assessment. So that's the first one.
That is already something we wanted to hear, and I'm going to show that everywhere if I have to talk about performance management. Now I even have Bill Torbert saying this, so this is
okay.
I wanted to then. I think we now have 10 more minutes. So I'll ask maybe another quick question on the ethics, because as you hear here, Bill, this notion of good and moral is something that is not quite letting us loose. I think you're writing in a paper on ethics of leadership that talking about ethics, even in your action logic, is not so easy, because what is good changes with the action logic. Secondly, you say people at the higher levels of action logic, so to speak, are normally in a position to do much more harm. So it could also be that someone doing an error unwillingly creates unethical effects. I'm still not quite satisfied, I have to say, because I think Kohlberg is making and Fowler is making the same cause for a normative morality at the highest level of maturity in adult development. I think you're skewing that question of morality a little bit by saying my morality is in developing the potential in everyone and the ecosystem around us. Where is that confidence coming from that if only we develop every single person, they will automatically become good in the context also of this interdependent society?
Well, they will only become good if the developmental process includes a great deal of second person caring and confrontation. In other words, the morality is a primarily second person function in practice. And so, it's not enough to have a theory of the good, obviously. And there is no, there is no final description of what's good apart from action in particular situations. There in the appendix in Numbskull, I quote, oh dear me, my dear beloved, who was it? Charles Olson, the American poet who was also the head of this crazy institution, Black Mountain College. But he says, if there is any absolute, it is no more than this: you're taking action now. So that's where the absolute resides. And the only way to help that be good is through mutual criticism. I went through one of those alchemist work parties I mentioned earlier, was largely developed to me being criticized for my relationship with women in the group. The group was half women, half men, this was incredibly shocking to me because I have spent my life with a particular reference to being mutual with women. I lost 10 pounds of weight in those 3 days. But it's whether the people who were attacking me, and it was rather an attack, were more correct or I was right all along, is not as important as the fact that we went through that process. It created greater mutuality among us, to become good, you really have to be vulnerable to feedback about whether you are being good or not in whoever's terms. So.
Very interesting. Very interesting. And Bill, again, thank you for being so open. And of course, we've read Eros Power, which again, I think was emblematic for a college professor being truly open about being in that continuous development. And Antoinette, what it resonates with me is this notion that we discussed yesterday about formation. And Bill, this is, again, I would love to introduce Simon Weston to you. I think there's some interesting parallels. He was talking about the formation of monks, and that in a development process, so to speak, for monks, it's actually multiple years of living in that community and finding the priest within. And I thought there was something very interesting in this notion. We will talk to Bruno Frey about his explorations with Benedictine monks in a few weeks. And it's going to be very interesting, I think. But time is almost up. And I think you have been many things, Bill. You have been a visionary. You have been a fighter. Sometimes with good results. Sometimes I guess it was problematic. You've been that jester. And very playful, I think, throughout. So we wanted to close you out, not with a quiz, but with a little playful exercise where I would love you to just give us 1 or 2 sentences or words on a number of individuals, concepts, and places. And the title of the section is Memories for the Future. What are the memories that you would give us as a kind of a little concept to dwell with for the future that we can learn from in relation to your own experience? So I will start it off. I think there are 10 also places and names. So we have 4 minutes, which gives you probably about half a minute or so for each. The first, of course, is Gurdjieff.
An unimaginable man with astonishing methods and astonishing outcomes. I always thought that if he had been alive when I was alive, I would not have been able to be his student. I was lucky he had already died, I thought.
Wonderful. And again, I think an invitation for everybody to have a look at the work and the Fourth Way by Gurdjieff. The second one, which when I first got your manuscript, again, thank you, Bill, of Numskull, I immediately went off to see everything about him. Bill Sloan Coffin.
Oh, well, he's one of my favorite people that's ever lived. He was the minister at Yale, and I had actually heard him preach when I was in boarding school, and instantly was enthused by him. He had incredible charisma, and he was both incredibly attentive to individuals and had a pastoral side to his ministry, but he was also a political minister, as you may know, and played a very significant part in the Peace Corps, the Civil Rights Movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement. And I continued to go and see him for the whole rest of his life. 3 weeks before he died, which of course I didn't realize was 3 weeks, I called him in Vermont, and he said, "Torbert, you've got to get ready to die. This is wonderful." He said, "Here I am on a bed, and there are 4 women unclothing me and reclothing me. This is paradise, Torbert." So he had an incredible sense of humor. As well as everything else.
Wonderful. And I think, again, I would invite everybody to have a look at his sermons. Actually, in the first volume of his collected sermons, there is an introduction that talks about the hermeneutics of testimony and the idea that bearing witness to our own transformation might be the only real way to bring other people to listen to us. And I think, Bill, again, I think you're living in that memory. So thank you for that. God.
Well, of course, it's the reverse of dog. Got to remember that. Seems too imposing and masculine. I'm much more in favor of feminist theologies at this point.
Wonderful. Which leads me to the next one, Greshing and Frabjus.
Oh my God, you have gone deep into my history. Well, yes, this was the name of the newspaper column I wrote for the Yale Daily News, and Frabjus is a word from Lewis Carroll, Callooh, Calais, oh Frabjus Day, which is a sort of expression of the wonder and joy of the universe. And I invented the word grashing to imply the reverse, a sort of gnashing of teeth and terrible weather and the world as it would be if there were no love in it.
Wonderful. I got a place, Wolfgangsee.
Wolfgangsee. Ja, ich habe nur gestern that's as much German as I can remember. I got an email from a wonderful friend, you may know him, Alex Jeanette, and he is Viennese, and he was flying over the Wolfgangsee just a week ago and took a picture of the whole Wolfgangsee with St. Gillian up at the top, and I just started weeping. That is my home place.
Wonderful. And you know that Helmut Kohl was also a great fan of Wolfgangsee. He spent almost all his holidays there. So you might have come across the German Chancellor in the time that you were there, unknowingly. I need to ask this one because I wonder what the reaction is now. Eros and power.
Aha. Well, the reaction is that if only we had published it 2 years later at the #MeToo moment, it might have in fact become popular and become more useful to more people. Because both Hillary and I were still in the academic doze of not believing in marketing, we didn't do much for the book, and it didn't do much for anybody else. I can't believe I wrote it. I turn red every time I look at it.
So did we, Bill, when we read it. But I think it's a wonderful inquiry into really some of the taboos. And again, we talked to Carl Sanford about the taboos in society and how important it is to know what the taboos are and maybe to reset them. So very, very intriguing. Ken Wilber.
He was called the Integral Institute. What was the name people gave him? I think they called him the Red Baron. That may not be quite right, but he has quite a unilateral management style that for me goes somewhere, but at the same time, I want to say he's a fabulous conversationalist, and we've had a couple of just lovely jester-like conversations. But it does show to me the difference between a kind of deep spiritual appreciation of life and the world and a leadership capacity to create a more mutual world. Those can be worlds apart.
Wonderful. And I think I was told he's just written a book about religion, and he's still alive and writing. And we will try to reach out to him and have a chat with him, and we will remind him of what you said if we can get there.
Thanks so much.
I've got two more, and then we are really out.
Although, if I just can kind of show in, the word God and to male kind of comes to my mind as well. But I mean, okay.
That resonated, I know.
I see.
The theater of inquiry.
Well, I had quit Harvard because I was incredibly depressed by the way the faculty and the deans organized the place, and the fact that that there was no collaboration about making the school any better. And so I resigned a year before my time was up, and I gathered together $14,000 and decided I could live for a long time on that, and wandered around the country in a pine green VW van and saw friends, and got out to San Francisco and settled down there for 4 months. And then I had no money left. I had 2 twins just got born, and their mother, and who I was making a commitment to. And so we came back to Boston because that's where we knew people. She was able to get a job, and I had to do something. So I created something called the Theater of Inquiry. And people are welcome to read about it in Numbskull in the Theater of Inquiry.
I mean, Bill, it's just, it's absolutely fascinating and frightening at the same time. And the final question I have is, we will talk to Henry Mintzberg tomorrow. And Henry Mintzberg is talking about rebalancing society. What is the one question from academic, from one active and contrarian sometimes and provocative academic to the next? What is the question you would ask Henry?
Ooh. You
may be as provocative as you like.
Yeah, thanks. And then you'll tell on me.
Exactly.
I'll only say something if you don't tell him that I'm the source of the question.
But he will see this probably on video, so we will do it afterwards then.
No, I think I'm going to draw a boundary there. I think I'm going to say, no, I'm not going to answer that question.
Very good. I love it. And I think that the interesting thing is Henry declared in a session that he had in Amsterdam once that it was the privilege of a university professor to critique everybody and never to do anything about it. And
there you go. That's exactly where my question would have been. You know, I said, you're a wonderful critic, Henry. I agree with your criticisms. And now what is the action that you are taking? But, you know, he's already answered that question with that.
But I think I will still quote you on that, Bill, because I think that will make my argument even stronger. I'm just kidding. Bill, I have to say, it's been an absolutely sublime pleasure. Antoinette and I were looking forward to this interview for weeks and weeks, and we are very, very glad that you made the time. As always, it was surprising, it was exciting, it was interesting, and I think very insightful. So I can only say a big thank you for this.
Well, thank you. It definitely was a lively time, and that depended upon the three of us. Really a pleasure to do this. I'm a little scared by the idea that somebody else will see it, but well, that's just how it's going to be.
I think that's
all right. Well, take care, both of you, and I hope there does come an occasion in the few remaining years of my life that we actually get to see each other in person.
That would be wonderful.
Thank you very much. Yeah, definitely.
Take care.
And with that, we close the session. And with that, we cut the recording, Bill. Thank you again.